Hello, welcome to the Petrach program webinar on Ukraine. Today my name is Lucan Wei. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petrach program for the study of Ukraine. Today, I'm extremely happy to introduce to you Ivan Gomza, Professor Ivan Gomza. I've been long wanting to get him to give a talk as part of our webinars. I first met him a number of years ago, I believe in 2018, when he was professor at the Kyiv Academy. He's an incredibly subtle thinker. He's best known, I think, to a lot of you for his very kind of measured and in-depth responses about the far right in Ukraine, and basically kind of trying to explain why, put that in context. Most remarkably, this project is something that he really began after the war. I mean, obviously from the topic you can tell that it began after the war, but it is quite remarkable to me that even in such trying circumstances as the war, we have someone who can sort of apply himself and create a whole new project, and that in and of itself is quite amazing. But quickly before he gives a talk, I want to sort of tell you that I will have to, as moderator, will have to leave at 11 o'clock. Martin Dichuk, Professor Martin Dichuk, Associate Professor at Western University, will take over in terms of fielding your questions. Again, I strongly encourage you at any point during the talk, put your questions in Q&A. The shorter the question is, the more direct to the point it is, the better. And finally, I just wanted to sort of let you know that just highlight a couple of talks that will take place next week. On May 10th, we're going to be having a panel with a number of scholars on the potential for Ukraine to join the European Union on May 10th. And then on May 17th, we're going to have a very interesting panel on Russian war crimes. So stay tuned for both of those. But without further ado, maybe Ivan, I'll just sort of hand it over to you, and then here you go. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Lucan, thank you for inviting me and for having me actually here. I started sharing the slide, and before we actually start, I think, to make a slight explanation about the new project, as Lucan mentioned it, because as the first shock of war provoked by the war settled a little bit down, and when I become actually, able to observe and analyze events, I had an eerie sense, something like I have seen it before. And that impression, it was not about Bucha massacre or the Mariupol drama theater grounded to dust by purposeful bombardment, but about how Russians were fighting the war. And then it dawned on me that hubris, that was the cause of that déjà vu feeling. And hubristic behavior, it was especially pronounced, prominent, and impactful during the first month of the war, the month of March. So when Professor Wei invited me to give a talk, I had no doubt about the topic I wanted to cover. It is the hubris of Mars. So let's start. The notion of hubris, it comes from ancient Greece. And initially, it was, and it meant, an instrumentalized violence with purpose to degrade its target. Aristotle, in his Rhetoric, remarks that, I quote, hubris means doing and saying things that cause shame to the victim simply for the pleasure of doing it. Men, he explains, are hubristic because they think they are better than other people, end of the quote. In classical Athens, hubris was a particular type of crime related to status. Perpetrators acted with arrogant violence, being sure of their position and depriving a victim of her status. There are numerous examples of hubristic behavior. For instance, let's observe the Greek mythology. Odysseus taunted the Cyclops that even a giant father, the god of the sea, would not manage to heal his eye. Enraged by the assault on his status, the god prolonged Odysseus' homecoming. Another hero, Bellerophon, decided to fly to the Mount of Olympus to sit with the gods, only to fall from his flying horse, Pegasus, and remain a deplorably crippled man by the end of his days. These and many other instances of hubristic behavior have two essential features. First, there is a supreme arrogance which violates the natural order of things. And second, there is a dramatic reversal of fortune. As a historian, Alistair Horn explains it, this reversal was called peripeteia, and it signified a falling from a great height to unimaginable depth. Disaster would often embrace not only the offender, I mean, but also his nearest and dearest, and all those responsible to him. Unlike ancient authors, we, I think, modern people, no longer believe in a God-defined order. However, the notion of hubris can describe a particular type of statesman behavior. After all, we often use structuralist theories to explain each given configuration in the system of international relations and the rules and limits it imposes on actors' behavior. States cannot act independently of structural constraints. If they do, they overstretch and they pay the price for their folly. Thus, international relations structure is the contemporary equivalent of the Greek natural order for statesmen. Likewise, no warlord could ignore terrain, logistics, and opponents' capabilities in the art of war without seeing his apparent victory evaporate. There is a military equivalent of the God-defined order for commanders. It is the operational level of war, where political goals and available resources meet together. And now I'm quoting Edward Luttwak and his definition of the operational level of war. To be successful in this operational theater, one should have well-grounded answers to three questions. First, what is to be accomplished? Second, how the goal will be pursued? And third, what will constitute the success? If a commander fails to conform to these requirements, the requirements of the operational theater, his troops act haphazardly and pay the price for their recklessness. So today, I want to discuss a great power's hubris. I use the term to describe an expressive use of violence that seeks to prove the unworthiness of a target and simultaneously ignores both the limits imposed by the IR structure and the realities of the operational theater of war. Such behavior often translates in unilateralism, disdain toward the opponent, unrealistic expectations, and status concerns. In this not so brief talk, I will compare the Russian rationale for invasion and the Russian strategy during the first month of invasion with three historical cases: the Parthian campaign led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the French war in Indochina, and the US invasion of Iraq. My choice is far from random, because considering the classical, modern, and contemporary history with the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war, I hope to tease out some reasons for great powers' underperformance and its possible political outcomes. So let's start with the Roman case. Throughout the second and the first centuries before Christ, the Roman juggernaut was steadily moving eastward from Italy to the heart of what was then the civilized world. And having snatched a victory out the jaws of defeat in the Second Punic War, Romans crushed with unexpected ease two eastern superpowers, the Macedonian kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom. And they established a puppet regime in Egypt. As a result, Rome controlled Italy, Iberia, Balkans, Asia Minor, and swaths of North Africa. By the year 53 BC, Romans also pacified Celts, finally achieving domination over the archenemy, who, unlike Hannibal, used to pose a constant threat and once managed to pillage the internal city. A string of stunning victories, over both the most advanced and most primitive armies made Roman confident of their military might. As a result, when Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the three most powerful men in Rome, moved over 40,000 men under his command from Roman Syria, you can see it on the map here in green, to Mesopotamia, everyone expected an easy victory against Parthia, deemed yet another decadent Eastern kingdom. Crassus ventured into Mesopotamia, not only to expand a Roman domain, but also in quest of personal glory. In this respect, he was actually no different from any other Roman general, like Sulla, Caesar, or Pompeius. Unlike his frenemies, I mean Caesar and Pompeius, however, Crassus had minor military achievements to sport. Unlike Caesar, who smashed redoubtable cells, or Pompeius, who enjoyed the cognomen, like the nickname Magnus the Great, for his countless victories in the East and in the West, Crassus' victories were unremarkable. Although he proved himself to be a skillful commander during the Roman Civil War and servile rebellions, these acts brought no glory. And Crassus yearned for victory, a victory against a foreign foe. And since it was of utmost prestige in Roman culture to smash a yet unknown opponent, he advanced into Parthia using the slightest of pretexts to attack. Moreover, Crassus rejected assistance in intelligence and logistics offered by a Roman ally, the Kingdom of Armenia, and instead of descending into Mesopotamia from Armenia, from Asia Minor, and thus having a secure supply line, Crassus launched an invasion from Syria, hoping to plunder prosperous cities in the Parthian soft underbelly. The result was a rout at Carrhae, in black circle on your map. 70% of Romans were killed and captured, and Crassus's own son and the commander himself, they were dead. And I want to highlight two crucial points of this dismal outcome. First, Crassus was utterly ignorant of the material his opponent were equipped with. Here, let me explain. Parthia represented the farthest western point in Eurasia where people used the Chinese-made steel. An explanation here is really important. Although we use the same word, steel, to describe alloy produced in Rome and in China, these were two very different compounds. We don't need to go into technical details, but you can do it in Q&A session. But suffice it to say now that Romans, they lacked proper knowledge of the carbon compound, which are required to produce high-quality steel. And as a result, Roman steel was brittle. The Chinese, however, made steel of the highest quality and were able to mass manufacture armor-piercing crossbow bolts and highly protective armor. And both the Chinese technology and weaponry arrived to Parthia via the Silk Road. The superiority of the Chinese steel was demonstrated on the battlefield of Carrhae. Parthian steel-tipped arrows easily punched through Roman shields and armor, and their steel lances could pierce through the entire bodies of a legionary. At the same time, Parthian horsemen were protected by layers of steel-enhanced armor impenetrable for Roman javelins. Thus, the unaccounted disparity in the military equipment decidedly tipped the battlefield against the Romans. So it was the first point, the first reason of their defeat. Secondly, Roman generalship, they failed to adapt to the adversary's tactics. Remember, I mentioned Macedonia, Seleucid Kingdom, and Celts. Actually, after fighting those adversaries, Romans grew confident that infantry in close formations, aided by skirmishers and cavalry for screening, was the victory recipe. In truth, they merrily outmaneuvered opponents who fought the very same way. In Parthia, they encountered for the very first time in their history a typical steppe warfare with swift cavalry movements, false retreats, and concentrated use of projectiles. This was only natural given the terrain, broad open spaces of the inner Mesopotamia. and to fight in those terrains in a testudo formation, those famous Roman Tortuga formation. So it was a typical Roman tactics when met with arrows, and it was sheer folly in the broad steppe of Mesopotamia. Roman became immobile and they perished from lack of supply and from Parthian hands. So hence the reasons for this dismal outcome. Let's go further. It was our first historical parallel. Now let's fast forward 2000 years and move to a completely different setting, to the jungle of Indochina, where the French were struggling to keep their colonial empire. Unlike Romans in the 1st century BC, France was a great power in decay. Smashed and occupied by Germans in 1940, humiliated by Anglo-Americans who were uneager to involve the French in the post-war order, France seemed to have little fuel for hubris. However, France was driven by status concern in Indochina. It nurtured unrealistic expectations and acted disdainfully toward their opponent. Let's check on it. In 1940, General de Gaulle believed his task was to rebuild France's independence and territorial integrity, including its colonial possessions. By 1944, with the liberation already achieved and North Africa under control, only Saigon and Hanoi were the final destinations of the national territorial recovery. The problem was the well-entrenched nationalist movement in Vietnam, further emboldened by a victory of an Asiatic nation, I mean Japan, against Europeans, I mean France, in 1940. As the French administration returned back to the peninsula, they landed in a Democratic Republic of Vietnam. It was proclaimed by Ho Chi Minh and broadly supported by the populace. The French were not prepared for changes. Even when they officially recognized the independent states in Indochina, they were eager to keep them under their influence. And the Tunisian leader, also a member of French colonial empire, Habib Bourguiba once noted, I quote, "When French say protectorate, they mean a direct rule. When they evoke the autonomy, they mean protectorate. And when they refer to independence, they mean autonomy," end of the quote. And to keep their domain in Indochina, Paris resorted to force. In 1947, they launched Opération Léa, intending to take under control a swath of highland tropical forests used by the Vietnamese leadership as a natural redoubt. 12,000 troops, including 1,000 of paratroopers, penetrated deep into the perimeter and all but captured Ho Chi Minh himself. General Salan boldly briefed his superiors in Paris that, I quote, "the nationalist redoubt no longer exists," end of the quote. French leadership grew confident that French troops were superior to their Vietnamese counterpart. By 1949, French garrisons in Indochina were molested by guerrilla no less frequently than those situated in France itself. And fighting continued only in the jungles, but the French controlled the most productive agricultural lands and major cities. So the victory seemed to be in hand. Revealingly, the French political leadership rejected implications that there was a war going on in Indochina. For instance, Jacques Bardeux, an MP and the grandfather of a future French president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, thus he was a typical political insider, he claimed, I quote, "It is neither war nor expedition, but just a police operation." This opinion was shared by the public, and the disdainful interpretation inbuilt is quite obvious. The fighting, however, continued. By 1950, the Vietnamese were generously supplied by the new communist rulers in China, and their troops, they inflicted several notable defeats on French and seized lands in the northern region. The French commander, General Later de Tassigny, fortified a so-called secured base of fire and lured Vietnamese to attack it just to tackle the mountain threat. Combining mobile groups with aircraft, General Later de Tassigny inflicted tremendous casualties on the opponent, and henceforth, Frenchmen believed that they had discovered the best tactics to win the war. The legend of paratroopers, les paras, was born. A little bit later, the Latter de Tassigny died of cancer, but it became a French credo that air power in combination with paratroopers constituted the magic formula. A successful French operation at Na San, when an airhead was used to lure a substantial Vietnamese force and annihilated by flanking artillery fire, corroborated this belief. Vietnamese responded with a devious response. They prompted the French to establish new bases aéroterrestres, thus provoking overstretches. The crown jewel of this strategy was a flanking movement to Laos. At that point, it was already an independent state. To counter, a new commander, General Henri Navarre, established an airhead at Dien Bien Phu. And before we go to Dien Bien Phu, it is worth considering the personality of Henri Navarre to understand his behavior and his choices. So first, Henri Navarre was a prominent staff and intelligence officer. He, however, had no experience of Asian warfare. Second, Navarre was highly intelligent to the point that his colleagues dubbed him an electronic computer. Yet overconfident in his planning capacities, he often ignored alternative opinions. And finally, being a product of intelligence service, Navarre cherished a habit of secrecy. And in combination, this proved to be a recipe for a final disaster. Pushing his predilection to secrecy to the limits, Navarre had the details of the Dien Bien Phu operation distributed only to the battalion commanders. The rank-and-file paratroopers were simply ordered to take warm clothing for highland operations, so they know next to nothing about what they were expected to accomplish. Once established, the airhead of Dien Bien Phu was believed to be impregnable. General de Castries testified to the Commission of Inquiry. I quote, "The general feeling was that Dien Bien Phu was very solid and that the Viet Minh knew it and would not dare to unleash a general assault. In the opinion of the leadership, there was no possibility of a general and sustained action." End of the quote. This statement reveals disdain toward a seemingly inferior opponent, the first constituent of the eventual French loss. French hubristically believed that a native Vietnamese commander did not possess enough tactical knowledge to assemble and maneuver a field army strong enough to assault and storm the air base at Dien Bien Phu. Their underestimation had two underpinnings. First, throughout the war, the French always commanded the skies. Second, the Vietnamese had to resupply their troops over 500 miles. Combine these two factors, promised a tactical masterpiece and an easy victory for the French operation. In truth, the 10,000-strong French garrison was supported via a 120-mile-long air bridge, and it was doomed by limited French airlift capacity and the Vietnamese ability to transport siege artillery. So, logistic miscalculations were the second factor that doomed the French effort. I want to dwell a little bit more on those miscalculations. In theory, French transport aircraft had enough capacity to resupply the paratroopers at Dien Bien Phu. However, many aircraft was damaged by Vietnamese man-pads and the harsh jungle tropical weather. Moreover, an alternative option to support the Dien Bien Phu garrison by land was unavailable because French land units were bound to the roads and they fell prey to constant ambushes. And moreover, the Air Force failed to detect and let alone to deter Vietnamese transportation of siege artillery. So, paying for General Navarre's hubris, 11,000 paratroopers were captured at Dien Bien Phu. The French war effort was paralyzed, and forced by this defeat, Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France requested a ceasefire on any conditions. And our third historical case. The French defeat eventually dragged US boots to the Vietnamese ground. However, there is no point in recounting the hubris of Lyndon Johnson and the outcomes of his hubristic behavior. Instead, I want to focus on the issue of how US political class overcame the Vietnam syndrome and what actually happened afterwards. So let's discuss how American political class grew overconfident while penetrating deeper and deeper into the greater Middle East, only to leave it rather hastily in 2022. Actually, the Middle East was the focal point of the American hubris because the American self-confidence, once shattered in Vietnam, began to recover with the first Iraqi war. However, the political repercussions of the new US confidence were hardly limited to the region. Rather, American politicians shed fear to intervene in other countries and launched ambitious nation-building programs globally. So what happened? To begin with, during the Bosnia crisis, American political class grew allergic to multilateralism. This was for a good reason. European partners tried to manage the calamity in Bosnia and operated through the United Nations with disastrous results. However, when US intervened, they stopped the genocidal Serbians, and instead of talking, they did something, and a new phase, that a spatial righteous force was reborn, came into being. The idea was taken a little bit further in Kosovo. President Clinton offered Serbs an alternative: leave Kosovo or be bombed. Eventually, the Serbian dictator got both the thrash and the disgrace. However, the noble cause concealed a critical wrinkle. The United States effectively intervened in the internal Serbian affairs, forcing Belgrade to vacate a part of its territory. Next, during the early Afghan and Iraqi campaign, United States politicians became assured that the might of a country that invests in its military more than the next 10 countries combined was unstoppable. Sure enough, from the military point of view, the accomplishment in Afghanistan was breathtaking. America was victorious in the landlocked country that was reputed to be the graveyard of empire in general and had fatally wounded the Soviet Union in particular. Just think about it. Uncle Sam deployed only 316 Special Forces troops and 110 CIA agents with laptops to accomplish the mission. Later in Iraq, the United States thrashed Saddam and his sizable army. Moreover, although the dictator himself, I mean the Saddam Hussein, taunted, I quote, that the United States relies on the Air Force, and the Air Force has never been the decisive factor in a battle in the history of wars, end of the quote, US Air Force proved him wrong. Laser-smart bombs were extremely precise and deadly effective. They grounded Iraqi troops to dust. A net result of the successful Kosovo, Afghan, and Iraqi wars was an inflated belief in smart weapons and air power. Building an impressive arsenal of cutting-edge weaponry would have been impossible without money. Luckily enough, by 1999, the United States managed to eradicate the budget deficit. This further facilitated investment in the military-industrial complex. Besides, some victories turned out to be fabulously cheap. For example, toppling down the Taliban cost only $2 billion, and both bombing Milosevic out of Kosovo and rebuilding the country cost only $30 billion. Suddenly, both war-making and reshaping nations appeared cheaper than expected in blood and money. Additional benefit came in the form of voters' approval. After the fall of Kabul, Gallup reported that President Bush enjoyed the whopping 87% of support. At this high point of national hubris, it looked like what Americans can dream, Americans can do. With the privilege of hindsight, we know that this was an illusion. First, US military became overstretched. It stationed troops in Bosnia, Kosovo, Haiti, Afghanistan, and Iraq and grew aware that the nation-building process would go in a less desired direction once the troops, pulled out. Iraq, check. Afghanistan, check. Second, lack of local knowledge proved to be a terrible drawback. Iraq is a case in study. To begin with, United States policymakers put their money on Ahmed Chalabi, who lacked deep roots in the Iraqi political soil. Next, after Chalabi proved to be a loser, they installed Paul Bremer as head of Coalition Provisional Authority, although Paul Bremer knew next to nothing about Iraq. However, his imperial rulings laid foundation to the horrors of ISIS. And third, a reckoning day, both personal and financial, finally arrived. Vice President Dick Cheney, who masterminded the invasion in Iraq, registered lower public approval than Michael Jackson after Michael Jackson, was accused of pedophilia. In the summer of 2008, President Bush became the first sitting president since Lyndon Johnson who have not attended his party presidential convention. And as for a paycheck, in 2002, White House advisor Lawrence Lindsay has been fired for voicing concerns that the invasion would amount to $200 billion US. By 2009, it had costed America $3 trillion. Worst of all, America fled Iraq and Afghanistan with its tail between the legs, leaving behind waste and breeding ground for extremists. Bosnia is a dysfunctional state, paralyzed by the imperfections inbuilt into its constitution, and Serbia remains ruled by an illiberal strongman who served as a minister under the dictator whom US helped to topple, Milosevic. So, it is time to spell out some essential regularities in the case of hubristic behavior, for they will help to explain the first month of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the much unexpected effectiveness of the Ukrainian resistance. Hubris, I argue, has much to do with it because Russia displayed typical hubristic features while invading. So, first, Russia was manifestly scornful towards multilateralism. Despite intentional US intelligence leaking about Russian plans, despite Biden's promise to train Ukrainians in guerrilla, despite Macron's effort to mediate, and the uproar of approbation in the United Nations, Russia ignored warnings from the international community and violated its rules. Putin observed the effectiveness of cocky unilateral behavior and cocky foreign policy of the Bush-Cheney administration, and the lesson has not been missed. However, arrogant unilateralism produced a vigorous response by the international community, which was understandably dismayed by the rules of the international cooperation and coexistence broken. Just think about the following statement. Many nations, after the Russian invasion, adopted policies they traditionally avoided. Switzerland joined financial sanctions. Germany abandoned its Russia-oriented energy policy. Turkey blocked the Straits. Finland decided to join NATO. And Poland accepted 2 million of Ukrainian refugees without a qualm, although just a year before, there were some clashes of the Polish government with the European Commission regarding the question of refugees. So my point is that states, international partners changed their behavior after the invasion because Russia violated principles of multilateralism. Second, observing the United States example, Russia emulated a twin strategy of investing surplus money of the years of plenty in smart weaponry and efforts to remodel the foreign nation, or foreign nations in plural. It has been recently revealed that Russia spent up to $1 billion to ferment discontent of the Russophone population in Ukraine and to promote pro-Russian politicians. Russian operatives should have known better. These pro-Russian clients siphoned the money and fabricated data on pro-Russian attitudes, significantly misguiding their Russian patrons. Putin even intended to bring low-profile politicians like Tsarev or Muratov, who have little support in Ukraine, to head the transitional government. And as for the smart weaponry, most of Russians' Wunderwaffe, like Su-34 strike aircraft, like K-52 attack helicopter, like Shtora tank defense system, like Panzer S-1 self-propelled anti-aircraft system, or Buratino thermobaric flamethrowers. So all those Wunderwaffe displayed unsatisfactory battle results. One can argue that each that project consumed vast amounts of Russian money and yielded ludicrous results. Third, Russian commanders were disdainful toward the Ukrainian army while rolling into Ukrainian territory. Their plan A envisaged capturing Kyiv within 4 hours. Their plan B was actually to do the same in 3 days. Russia even minted medals for capturing Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv. They mocked they were going to kroshit ukrop, a pun meaning to cut deal, since deal and Ukraine sound somehow similar in Russian. For, like Henri Navarre, Russians believed that more numerous and better planes would compensate for poor logistics and poor planning. Russians were especially confident in their air power, and they believed that air supremacy should contribute to an easy victory. Instead, they committed the logistical mistake Military Science 101 explicitly teaches to avoid. They moved in long columns on main roads, exposing themselves to ambushes, artillery fire, and UAVs. Russian infantry was sent with food provision for only 5 days, and tanks and artillery units had 2 munition packs at best. Russian paratroopers landed on airstrips without support from their artillery, and they fall prey to Ukrainian counterattacks in Hostomel and Vasylkiv. And besides, the seaborne assault was prescheduled for the worst possible month of the February, when the Black Sea is notoriously rough. As a result, amphibious troops spent 2 weeks in vessels and waited for an occasion to land. Since it has never materialized, they were redeployed, tired and unprepared, as French paratroopers at Dien Bien Phu. They were deployed to Kherson with dismal effectiveness. Fifth, just like Romans who rushed into Parthia without collecting information on what the opponent was equipped with, Russians proved to be unprepared to NLAWs, javelins, starstreaks, and stugnas Ukrainian possessed and knew how to use. And finally, just like Crassus, Russian generalship failed to adapt to the adversary's tactics. The rigid command and control structure precluded junior officers' initiative. It made them ignorant of the strategic order of battles. Ukrainians instead fought in small mobile groups with considerable freedom of action. In other words, Ukrainians practiced the modern warfare dubbed the swarm tactics by David Kilcullen. Using the swarm tactics, Ukrainian soldiers moved in small quasi-autonomous squads. Such units remained connected via encrypted messengers, so they could join their firepower if needed. As a result, swarm tactic units, they enjoyed the benefits of moving dispersed and fighting concentrated. This approach left enough space for minor officers' initiative, opportunity seeking, and serendipitous discoveries. Equipped with anti-armor personnel rockets and man-pads, Ukrainians inflicted heavy casualties, whereas Russians stuck to their orders. By the way, observers are amazed by the abnormally high casualties among Russian flag officers. During the 1 month of the war, there were confirmed kills of 7 generals and 15 colonels. The reason for this carnage in the high-ranking officers is that they, Russian officers, have to stay close to their troops to command and see the orders obeyed, since they alone were issued with the strategic order of battle. Finishing my presentation, wrapping it up, here is my main argument. The Russian political leadership committed an error of overstretching when it ignored the values and norms of the international community. Russian generalship misunderstood the realities of the theater of war they ventured in. As a result, Russian troops acted haphazardly without proper strategic wisdom. These are omens of peripeteia. Putin's regime is fallen to unimaginable depth, and the disaster will bring down all those responsible to him. Hubris is always punishable, if not by gods, then by men. So, thank you for your attention. I hope it was interesting, and now I'm open to all your questions.
Thank you, Professor Gomza. That was a wonderful talk. We can't clap, but we can say this. I just want to say, first of all, that I actually forgot to introduce you, and I apologize. Professor Gomza, I was so excited to have Professor Gomza that I just utterly forgot the most basic information. He is the head of public policy and governance at the department at the Kyiv School of Economics. But I wanted to first sort of, your talk is really wonderful, showing these sort of remarkable similarities across, to put it mildly, quite diverse historical cases. A few questions come to mind. I'm going to start with this one. This is also reflected by the Professor Gurevich. How do we explain hubris in the Russian case? I mean, many people, including myself, predicted that he would not do full-scale invasion. And this was because Putin actually acted relatively prudently in the recent past. So in 2014, he only invaded, he didn't sort of try a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He sort of did, invaded parts that were sort of traditionally more Russophile. Similarly, in Georgia in 2008, he chose not to invade the whole country, and as a result, I think, partly as a result, the response by the West was relatively muted, and so I think a lot of us sort of saw him as being relatively cautious. So I guess the question is, well, what explains the Putin of, how did the Putin of 2008 and 2014 turn into the Putin of 2022? And I think, that's really kind of, can you sort of comment on that?
Well, to begin with, don't forget that I used the notion of hubris intentionally. I mean, when it comes, you are shocked like the observers. Think about Odysseus, yeah? Why did he have to taunt the Cyclops? I mean, you have already escaped. Why on earth provoke his father, the god? So, I mean, hubris is always unexplainable from the rational point of view. So that is why Putin's hubristic behavior is quite shocking. Actually, I was among those who didn't believe in the full-scale invasion. I also expected something like, complications in the Donbas region. Maybe what they are doing right now, like building the land bridge to Crimea. So that was something I expected. Not that they will attack Kyiv. I fled Kyiv just because of that. So, but the answer to your question, why, might be in the point, and the point, I'll bring out the point, citing a book by Fiona Hill. In her Operative in Kremlin, Fiona Hill explains that inside Putin's personality, there are like 6 different personas. I'm not going to cite all of them, count on all of them, but one among them was the history man, the man enamored with history and who can, control the historical narrative for his own purposes. So my answer to your question, Lucan, is that actually I think, unlike Putin in 2002, 2004, 14, when those 6 personas actually coexisted and none become dominant, he, being an old man, actually came under the spell of the history man. The history man who reads the Russian history, who doesn't read Ukrainian history, Baltic history, who see parallels only with some glorious days of the Second World War, who actually wants to make history, and now he ventured all he have created in Russia, including his, let's say, empire, just to make history better and to become a man of history. So that is my answer. In a nutshell, he is a little bit self-absorbed, and that is the reason of his hubristic behavior.
Okay, thank you. So I guess my other question kind of builds on this, which is that at one level, you said, it's clearly kind of a function of hubris. I mean, there appears to have been disagreement within the Russian elite over the invasion. On another level, the kind of things he was saying about Ukraine are very familiar to anyone who's, as I have, spent time in Moscow. When you talk about Ukraine, this is not sort of out of the blue, and he does seem to reflect, and I'm sure everyone in this webcast will agree that, preaching to the choir, reflects sort of, many sort of standard Russian stereotypes about Ukraine. Furthermore, I mean, it's, you think about Russian history, it's not hard to come up with numerous examples of hubris: the Russo-Japanese War, Afghanistan in 1979. I mean, sort of somewhat different, but sort of the failure of Stalin to predict, Nazi invasion. I mean, so is there something Russian? First of all, to what extent does this reflect sort of broader Russian cultural trends? Is there something in sort of Russian society or Russian leadership culture that makes hubris more likely?
Well, as a scholar, I often, try to oppose those broad cultural explanations, something like Russians are like that or Americans are like that. I mean, there are some periods during Yeltsin administration when Russia was quite, not humiliated, but, unarrogant, let's put it that way, quite modest. Or you can see that, let's say, during the Napoleonic invasion, Tsar Alexander I was actually thinking about building a concert in Europe to fight actually the invaders and Napoleon, and he was like he was not unilateral but multilaterally thinking. So it is not about Russian culture, it's rather about the position of Russia in the region which provokes those feelings. I mean, if you compare Russia to its neighbors, and I'm not talking about China, but about Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Georgia, and even Ukraine, those seem to be, like minor forces. They are not like the regional players. So in the region, Russia has it seemed to have let's put it that way, no competitors, no adversaries. Their adversaries are always somewhere on the other side of the ocean, I mean, in the United States, or maybe at least somewhere on the other side of Elba, because Germany used to be that arch enemy. So what I'm trying to say, Russia is not easily contained, but it's by its neighbors. And that is why, seeing itself as a powerful state, they tend to recreate and reemerge as hubristic statesmen.
Okay, thank you for that. Standard comes a very nice and subtle distinction there. I guess the other question has to do with sort of the notion of hubris. So, I mean, these are obviously, not criticizing you, but these are obviously, we know you were hubristic acts because we know post factum what happened, right? But of course, another way of talking about hubris is audacity, right? Which is to say, you take risks and you succeed. And I think of, to me, the most sort of, stunning example of that is Mao Zedong after World War II, when everybody, the US allies, Stalin, told Mao, do not try to take control of China. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, are much better armed, much better funded. And Mao did many of the things that you describe here. He ignored expert knowledge. He had an exaggerated sense of his own capacity. But the result was that you had the creation of the Chinese Communist Republic. And so I guess the question is there a way, can you think of ways of distinguishing audacity from hubris that is not ex post? Excellent.
Actually, I think that only the privilege of hindsight brings the difference. Because, in case had Mao Zedong actually failed in China, it would have been only a minor footnote in history, a crazy guy who tried to overcome the warlord, the Chiang Kai-shek. Another example of that audacity, like the victorious audacity, is Fidel Castro in Cuba, Yes, he did it only with several guys coming from Sierra Madera. So what I'm trying to say that it is actually that fine line between arrogance, hubris, and audacity, which people with who are heroes, they tend to ignore. That is why I started with heroes from the ancient history. I mean, Bellerophon, he accomplished several deeds. He killed the chimera, yes, like the beast with 3 heads. And Odysseus, he also was a hero. So they had something under their belt to be self-assured. And then they just missed the line between I can and I cannot. So maybe Mao hasn't just reached his I cannot line in 1949. Maybe he reached that line during the Cultural Revolution. That is what I'm trying to say. That he, maybe not Cultural Revolution, but the Great Leap Forward. That was his hubristic behavior. And Castro also had his not to cross line when he tried to build socialism in Cuba, and it was a failure. So heroes, they tend to be heroic just before being hubristic and afterwards humiliated.
Okay, but you're saying that you can't tell beforehand.
No, it's it's like with the revolutions, and I think it's a good example. Failed revolutions are called coups, yeah, and maybe like uprisings. Successful uprisings, they are revolutions. In the common sense parlance, not in scientific way of thinking of those events.
Okay. So do you think, I mean, this related, please, I encourage you to ask more questions. I mean, in the chat. I'm curious whether, because it seems like, in my understanding, sort of talking about, the kind of leader Putin is, Putin is someone who I had always thought of as a kind of classic authoritarian leader in the sense of a small c conservative, someone who'd had no revolutionary ambitions to change Russian society. He always simply wanted to have power and get as insanely rich as possible, but had no sort of any kind of genuinely revolutionary agenda. But what we see in the sort of the Putin of 2022, and if you look at his speeches, he's really become almost a kind of revolutionary Putin, right? That he wants not simply to sort of keep power, but really transform in a fundamental way the international environment. I mean, would you agree with that characterization?
Well, I'll start with the thesis that many scholars actually tended to consider Putin as a pure kleptocrat, yes. So intent on grabbing power and money, enriching himself and his circle. And at the same time, they missed some of the other points of his persona. I mean, don't forget that in order to become more and more powerful and more rich, from time to time, you have actually to quell your opponents, not inside, but abroad. So when Khodorkovsky fled, to Switzerland, then after he was left out of the prison, maybe you need to push the collective West in the direction not to let the opponents to voice out their let's say disagreements with Putin. So what I'm trying to say, internal stability, including the personal enrichment of a kleptocrat, should never be taken outside of the internal of the foreign relations. One way or another, it comes to deals and dealing with our other foreign powers. So Putin could have, or not could have, but he was able to remain like a usual kleptocrat before his ambitions pushed him to further incurse into the foreign policy in the near abroad, as he called it, and that near abroad actually lured him into the global conflagration. So what I'm trying to say, I actually wouldn't agree that Putin of 2022 is like a revolutionary leader. For me, he is still afraid of the masses. Unlike Mao, who actually addressed the student, the Hunveibin, the Red Guards, during the Cultural Revolution to smash his opponents, Putin is not doing this. His Nashi I think you might remember that social movement initiative. It failed miserably around 2016, and afterwards, Putin's preferred to, to use the state apparatus, the army, the internal police to control the population and not to mobilize the population on its support. It doesn't mean that he never uses it, but well, any dictator, even the kleptocrats, even the neo-patrimonial dictators, from time to time, they resort to that strategy. I mean, Mobutu Sese Seko, the archetype of the, kleptocrat, neo-patrimonial dictator, he actually tried to impose on his society the ideology of Mobutism. It failed miserably. The Putinism actually is still not an ideology. It's a hodgepodge of different ideas. And, it is no communism with, universal appeal to Western intellectuals. It is rather a kind of ideas Milosevic could have projected to the outer world in 1990s. For most of the people, including intellectuals, it was, what the hell? What is this narrow-minded nationalist? That is the same situation with Putin. So I think, that he is really afraid of his own people, and he won't be able to induce the mass support. So he is no revolutionary leader. He has internal, in his guts, fear of revolutions. Don't forget, that is the guy who observed in Dresden how the people's power was taking out the Stasi archives, and since his youth days, he is afraid of the people's power. That is might be the reason he is so disdainful and afraid of Ukraine at the same time. We had Orange Revolution and Euromaidan Revolution. His, nightmares come true.
Right. So I mean, I guess my point here was not so much that he, a revolution in the sense of a domestic revolution, but certainly his vision of radically overturning the international structure of power is profoundly revolutionary.
Okay, so he's a revisionist. That is the point. He is a member of the revisionist international power. Yes, he is a revisionist for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I just I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'm going to hand it off to Marta. And first of all, thank you very much. This was an incredibly stimulating talk, and I just, it's such a pleasure to chat with you. So I'm just there was another question by Mary, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, Tito. It was just, it talks about sort of, I guess, if we could sort of rewind history, is there any sort of foreign policy difference or change in the American behavior that might have prevented this? So I mean, you have a whole wing of people talking about NATO, which is ridiculous for a number of reasons I won't rehash here. But another sort of talk about sort of President Obama's very muted response to the 2014 invasion of Crimea. We was also much more proximate, Biden's flight from Afghanistan. So do you think there's anything sort of that the West might have done to discourage or that might have changed Putin's behavior? And I'm just going to sign out. But
they should have done something in 2008 when Russia incurred into Georgia, because that was the very first signal that Western counterparts are ready, to close eyes on the blatant disregard to international norms in order to have business as usual. After President Sarkozy actually masterminded that peace treaty, which helped Russia to cut parts of Georgia from Georgia, it was like the very beginning of the Russian revisionist, self-assuring behavior in the world. And then, yes, for sure, the Crimea, it was another. So red lines are not only to be drawn, but to be effectively politicized and imposed. And when you draw red lines only with paint, not with bullets, people want to check whether you say chicken.
My name is Marta Petrach. I'm going to be stepping in because Lukin has to scoot off to another meeting. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. A lot of questions have appeared in the Q&A chat, which I will get to, but using my prerogative as the new chair, I'm going to ask you two of my own questions and then we'll go to the audience. You presented a very interesting analysis of understand why this is happening. My two questions are, Putin is a KGB trained person. Information is something that he is used to collecting, analyzing, and using as a guide in his policy. And yet, you mentioned this, a lot of people have talked about this, the information that he received allegedly from these pro-Russian Ukrainian politicians, people are saying he used that as one of the reasons to launch this large-scale invasion. Clearly inaccurate information. So that doesn't make sense to me. Somebody who is used to dealing with information makes decisions on clearly inaccurate information. And the second, well, let's start with that and then I'll do my other one. So how do you explain that?
Well, in political science, we have a beautiful metaphor of the dictatorial fog. And that dictatorial fog, it refers, to the situation when the neo-patrimonial dictator who rules as the biggest boss in the jungles and who puts on every administrative position in bureaucracy, in military, his loyal people. And as a result, those loyal people, they are really afraid to present the boss with the information which does not corroborate his own vision. So actually, they feed the biggest beast in the jungle with the food which makes him blind. And in that dictatorial fog, not only Putin, but there are many other dictators, they become, alienated, utterly alienated from the realities on the ground. So that is the reason. The system he created in Russia actually paid back and made him, really opt for a very bad decision.
Okay, well, thank you. That's an answer that I'm not sure I'm convinced by, because we're focusing so much on Putin, and yet he is clearly a totalitarian leader, but he's operating within a system, which clearly he's running. But I think there's more to that story. But that answer leads me to a question that's in the chat posed by Melly Lamani. There are voices saying that Putin is ill and he wants to leave a glorified legacy behind. Do you think that this is part of the rationale, and how does that fit into perhaps other leaders' behavior that you mentioned?
Well, once again, actually, as a scholar, I never try to explain political regimes by the personality of the leader on the top. I mean, it is always about system. That system he or she, actually, usually it is he, created. So when I say the Putin's system, the Putin's state, it doesn't mean that he only is in charge. I mean, but the system is designed in such a way that it functions just the way I described it. So it is a personalized dictatorship. And as a personalized dictatorship, it actually has all those sub-layers of other people who have their agendas and try to promote their interests. But still, the way Putin actually contributed to its development is the reason why he stills on the top. So it's like trying to answer to your second question, Marta, about that you don't buy my explanation. It is not an explanation. It is all about Putin. It is about the system. He actually is a part of, like the most important part of the system. It doesn't mean that that part defines the system in all its parts, but without that detail, the system won't function as it was intended. So that's how I view Putin. Now to that question in the Q&A chat. Well, it invites us to go into a kind of psychoanalysis, to dive into a man's head, and it's always quite difficult. But a guy is 70 years old. He has suffered several health problems. Maybe he is being with Alzheimer right now. So maybe, I'm not his doctor, maybe he is terminally ill. And being ill, he wants to have his mark on his country, on the region, and maybe on the globe. And that is the reason why, being a history man, he wants to make history, and that is why he behaves that way. So, I mean, it is a possible explanation, but to buy it completely, we actually need access to archives, access to the people who are around him, and maybe to Putin, his memoirs himself. So not enough data to make that definitive statement.
Thank you. There's another really good question by Matthew Light, who thanks you for a fascinating presentation. Do you think Russian failure to take Ukraine seriously as an opponent might reflect the perception that Ukraine is not a real country, that a lot of Russian behavior in Ukraine presents Ukraine as a rebellious province rather than an independent state? And this is sort of the mental maps that Russia and Putin are operating with. This is not for a separate country. This is a rebellious province that we need to put down and bring under control. How would you respond to that?
Well, that's a great question. But before I'll start answering, please consider that not all rebellion provinces are treated with disdain. I mean, very often when there was a rebellion in the Ottoman Empire or somewhere in Habsburg Empire, very powerful troops were deployed there actually to quell the rebellion. So what I'm trying to say, being a province, a colony, doesn't mean that you are expected to be a negligible adversary. So sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But with Ukraine, now directly to the question of Professor Light, with Ukraine, there was definitely that narrative in play. Ukraine is a 404 inextant country. Ukraine is not a real country without a real president. He's just, a joking man without a real army. That is why that joke about Krashit Ukrop, cutting deal. So they have no real identity. Russians clearly have that disdainful attitude toward Ukraine, and it was in play. If there is no country, with no army, with no president, there will be no resistance. And actually, we now have some information that they arrived here to Ukraine, with clear expectations to be met as liberators. They actually envisaged something like, in Crimea, when no shot was fired, when everything was easy, relatively easy, and they imposed their governance on the peninsula. So they expected the reiteration of Crimea. Instead, Ukraine has not, let's say, lost 8 years since 2014. We prepared, we cooperated with NATO and Canada, by the way, in the way we trained our military. We built some magnificent fortification line in Donbass. We reintegrated into the international alliance system, even although we are not an official ally. So we took the warning of 2014 when Ukraine was left alone in the cold, and we tried actually to make some lessons, to take some lessons from that experience. Russians, blinded by their easy victory in 2014, they made no lessons, and that is why treating Ukraine as a quasi-country, as a non-country, they failed so miserably during the first month of the war.
So hubris again. Lots of people are fascinated by Putin. Peter Gurevich asks a question, which again, I think is a good one. What do you think of the interpretation that Putin is covering up domestic weakness? Feeling vulnerability at home, the economy's in poor shape. He got a lot of popularity attacking Georgia and the Chechens. So is this just trying to cover up domestic weakness?
Well, that is precisely the point I was trying to make when I said that even psychology, when you talk with Putin, when you dwell into his mind, is not enough to explain, because psychological explanations, they can be rebuffed or maybe compounded with other calculations, like that one about domestic policies. Because actually, I do concur that Putin had some problems with his legitimacy at home. So we know that rally around the flag effect was really helpful for him to come to power and to consolidate his power during the Second Chechen War. Next, it helped him including with the transition of power in 2008, power from Putin to Medvedev and then back to Putin. And we know that rally around the flag effect during the Crimea annexation actually helped to skyrocket his popularity among the domestic public. So I would argue that in addition to his possible dementia, or let's put it mildly, with his preoccupations with his historical mission, a much more mundane calculation that I am going to have the elections in 2024, and the last elections in 2018 were really dismal, and the results were not the one in Kremlin expected. So since he has to have the elections of 2024, this was definitely a part of his calculation to improve his legitimacy at home with a little glorious war. And I'm quoting little glorious war quite intentionally because don't forget, it was the Russian invention. It was the term which under Romanovs was used to explain why Russia had to attack Japan. And as we know, the history teaches us, desiring to avoid a revolution at home, they started a war abroad, and finally they had a revolution at home and a defeat as well. So
yes, no, that's an excellent parallel. I've been thinking about that as well. There's a question/comment from Katerina Chmil. Why is Putin's motivation resonating so strongly to the Russian population? Can some answers be found in the great Russian culture, at least partially?
Well, just, tracing back to what I told Lucan, although as a scholar, I don't like explanations solely from the cultural point of view. Something like, as I said, Americans are like that, or Americans like big cultures, big soda, big wine, and big country. So just, although I don't like that kind of explanations, we must not eschew some cultural explanations. So we have to have, a complete picture when you take the political calculations, the personality of the leader, and the culture he functions in as well. So my answer to this question is yes, the great Russia chauvinist culture, Великая русская культура, is actually a part of the explanation why the Russian people resonate so well with the image of in extant Ukraine Putin offers to his citizens. So, I mean, for Russian people, Ukraine is not a country. It is, a kind of funny guys who live just on the other side of on the other part of the border, but actually they are like us. They speak the Slavic language, they share our internet memes, they read our great literature. So they're not a real country, a real nation. And that's why having those chauvinist, imperialist, colonialist attitudes, they actually really buy the ideas Putin feeds them with.
Thank you. Thomas Bruce, a PhD student, saying, does exceptionalism fit into your framework at all? The sense that the leaders' view of themselves, their abilities, their national identity?
Actually, I have, can you repeat me the question?
Certainly. Does exceptionalism fit into your framework at all? In the sense of the leader's view of himself, his ability, perhaps part of their national identity?
Well, do you mean Russian exceptionalism? I mean, yes, Russia has like a long culture, a long tradition of seeing itself as the Narod Bogonosit, translating from Russian, the God-caring people. So they think about themselves like the third Rome, and citing the Philophae, the man who masterminded the Russian, not yet Romanovs, but exactly Russian Empire, who said that there used to be two Romes, like the Rome, the Constantinople. Now the next Rome, and Rome means the global empire, is in Moscow, and there will never be yes, so the global Rome, the global empire. So there will never be the fourth Rome. So what I'm trying to say, Russian culture is very exclusivistic, they consider themselves not like a part of Europe, not as a part of Asia. And there is a special notion of Eurasia and Eurasian nation. You might recall Bloch, it's a famous poet of the beginning of the 20th century, where he says, yes, we are the Asiatic people. Yes, we are the Scyths, and we are going to destroy you, feeble Europeans. So it's, it's a poet who says that. So what we see here is that intentional opposition to both China, like the Asia, the Orient, and Europe, the West. And that exceptionalism, it also constitutes a part of the resource available to the leader. When the people believe they don't conform to any rules, when they believe that they are not from this world, but that they are chosen by the God, they can behave quite in inhumane way. And that's something we are seeing now. So what I'm trying to say, that part of Russian culture exists, and it contributed to their awful, inhuman treatment, both of civilians in Ukraine, and before that, the way they treated Hungarians in 1956, as they treated Poles in 1830 during the uprising, and many, many other instances.
Another question, which I'm not sure if it follows nicely from this one by Edward Reeve, and this speaks to your main theme. Would Russian hubris continue if for some reason Putin was to be displaced for power? So if Putin gets removed, will this hubris continue?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, everybody who thinks about Russia and about the Russo-Ukrainian war also has that preoccupation in mind. I mean, after Putin, what will be after Putin? And I have no good answer to your question, because the next guy who might, like in the line of succession, who might come to power should something bad happen with Putin, is a coup or maybe a natural death. It is Nikolai Patrushev. And Nikolai Patrushev, he shares the very same organizational culture that Putin represents. I mean, Patrushev also came from KGB. He's very dark-minded. He's suspicious about human motivations. In any event, he sees that his opponent or maybe partner seeks for his or her own benefits. So, and that the same notion Patrushev has about the international politics. So, in case Patrushev succeeds Putin, the question is whether the policy and foreign policy will change. And as I said, I don't know, because we have a great example of Stalinist, post-Stalinist succession, when actually after Stalin, for a very brief period of time, to power came Lavrentiy Beria. And Lavrentiy Beria was a guy whose arms until his elbows, by his elbows, were in blood. He literally—
Yes, but what did they do? They executed him and said, enough. And
exactly.
Let's do
But before he has been executed, he actually started liberalization program. And it is, a fascinating story that when I don't know how to call him, a killer, yes, he was a killer, a murderer, Beria came to power, he actually started liberalizing his country. Not because he believed in liberalism, not because he believed in human rights, but because economically.
He was afraid. Yeah, he was afraid for himself.
Economically, the Soviet Union was so, out of powers. I mean, it has extinguished its internal resources, that he and Malenkov and other people, they actually thought, well, we cannot continue with the Stalinist model. We have to liberalize it. And so Beria, he liberalized it. Maybe, even in case Patrushev comes to power, maybe he, forced by sanctions, would have to adopt the very same line. Maybe no. So we don't know yet. I mean, it's too difficult to make those judgments, because the system as it is now, it is quite closed. We don't know what is currently going on inside Kremlin. Are there bulldogs fighting under the carpet, using the Churchill phrase about the Soviet Union? Are they really united as a winning coalition? It is quite unclear. So we don't know yet.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's completely unclear, but I have a feeling that there There's something going on under the carpet. Valentina Litvin has a good question, which leads from this. Could the significant losses of the war outweigh and break this hubris?
Yes, definitely yes. Because just building on a parallel we mentioned before with Marta, yes, the Russo-Japanese War. 2 years of fighting, the Baltic Fleet completely destructed, the Russian army, land army, shattered at Mukden, and finally Romanov's empire was brought on its knees. So several years of hubris, then a dismal outcome, and people actually started thinking. So in case of good, I mean, huge losses inflicted on Russia, the hubris will be dispelled. And that is exactly, I would say, the end game for Ukraine. It is our end spiel. That is something we have to goal to aim for. We have to inflict more and more damages to show them that they are no heroes, no like, superhumans who come here and change history. They just people from flesh and blood who are going to be killed here en masse, and then one day it will dawn on them. Enough is enough. We have paid in blood and in money, and now we have to stop and reconsider our behavior.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to go to the one that just appeared by Patricia Marcin Vaughn. I don't know how many people in the audience watched Servant of the People. I did for my research on media in Ukraine. But the question, I think, is, again, a very good one. Did the Servant of the People feed into Russian political culture the opinion that the Ukrainian leader is just a comic? And did this perhaps feed into some of the decision-making in the Kremlin?
I have to be honest, I have not watched the movie. I mean,
oh, it's on Netflix. You should watch it. It's very useful. Yeah.
Well, actually, I consciously avoided it. I didn't want to watch it. I mean, when it was popular. And I think I'm a minority in Ukraine. My parents, for instance, they watched it. I know it for sure. But I would agree with the answer inbuilt in the question that it is for sure that Russian popular culture was aware of the Servant of the People. Moreover, we know that FSB, the special service, knew very well the biography of Volodymyr Zelensky, which means they were quite aware that he was just a mass media guy, a guy from a television, a guy keen on, being popular, making good jokes, and have a good life. So actually, I'm quite sure that they expected him to run for a cover, to duck in, to be afraid, and to take that ride he was offered by the DC, I mean by President Biden, the very first hours of the war. And the way that he actually surprised everybody is another matter for a huge discussion. How on earth was it possible? A guy who actually had his electoral support seen plummeted after 2019, who actually was ridiculed both in Ukraine and abroad, actually turned to be a hero. That might be another story, another, good parallel with Greek myths and some lessons to be learned.
Well, when you have time, do watch it because it's insightful into trying to understand how Zelensky thinks, and it's much deeper than that sort of comedian superficial image. Final question from the amazing Meli Limani from Western University. Based on your analysis of historical events, how do you see the end of this war? Question we're all thinking about. Some of the other cases you mentioned, such as the case in Kosovo and Bosnia, it took NATO intervention to end these wars, followed with the overturn of dictatorship regime from within. So pull out your magic ball and see what do you see?
Now, to begin with, I want you to understand clearly what I was trying to say when I mentioned Bosnia. Bosnia, I considered Bosnia not as an example of war or to be emulated or repeated here in Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia. I was using Bosnia case to show the way American hubris has been built. So Bosnia contributed to it, just as Afghanistan and Iraq. And the question how the war would end actually brings us back to the answer I have already given. hubris of Rome was shattered in Parthia, and Parthia remained the regional adversary for the Rome till the very end of that country. I mean, the Rome. France and French hubris was shattered, and France was forced to live in Indochina and Vietnam as an independent nation. And as for the United States, they actually left the greater Middle East. So the way this war would be over is that Russian hubris is contained, is actually destroyed, and afterward, Ukraine remains an independent country, which plays important role in the regional politics.
That's a good answer, but I'm just wondering, how do you destroy the hubris? So is it through military defeat?
Can you repeat, please?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, but how do you destroy the hubris? Is it through military defeat?
Exactly. It is through military defeat and political process. Because don't forget, I will quote Clausewitz and his definition of war, very famous one, that war is politics with other means. What he was actually trying to say, and people often don't understand it, is that when you wage a war, you don't want simply to kill the soldiers of the other army. You want to change policy and politics in your adversary and applied by your adversary. So, taking that Clausewitzian perspective, the hubris is to be overcome when we fight Russians long enough and via political process, convince them that you have better options, including exit options from Ukraine, than to continue fighting.
There was a question that I just saw right at the beginning, which is probably not a good note to end on, but I'd like to just read it out. Murray Tito, how can Ukraine hope to prevail without a continuous supply of weaponry? Russia is destroying the Ukrainian rail transportation system, and NATO is unprepared to fly over Ukraine.
Well, I would say that that is a matter of interpretation, because actually we have the so-called Lend-Lease bill drafted and adopted by the United States. We have the very good cooperation with Poland, with Slovakia, with Spain, for instance, who are actually actively trying to help Ukraine with their supply issue. And despite the fact that Russia is trying to dismantle the railway infrastructure, they are far from being successful. I mean, they destroyed a railway line, we are rebuilding it, and we are bringing the supplies back. So even without the NATO no-fly zone, which is not going to happen in my humble personal opinion, even without that, we have enough of borders with Poland, with Slovakia, with Romania to still continue bringing resources to fight the Russian army step by step.
And that, I think, is a wonderful note to end on. I would like to invite the audience to join me in thanking Professor Gomza for such a comprehensive, historical, analytical, interesting presentation, and all of the audience for all your excellent questions. And we will be having more seminars in the Petrach program for the study of contemporary Ukraine at the Center for Russian and East European Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Lots of titles to get in there. So please follow us on Facebook or visit us on our website. Thank you, Professor Gomza. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me. Have a good one.
Thank you.